August 17, 1943, over Schweinfurt, Germany. Flying Fortress No. 297 was burning at 25,000 feet, burning while still trying to maintain formation, burning while crew members screamed into intercoms and struggled with jammed escape hatches and watched flames spread through the fuselage. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be invincible. That was the promise. That was what Boeing engineers said when they designed it. That was what Army Air Force generals believed when they ordered 12,131 of them at a total cost exceeding $14 billion in today's money. The most expensive weapons program in American history up to that point. More expensive than battleships, more expensive than entire armies. $14 billion invested in a bomber that would supposedly win the war through strategic bombing alone. 4 engines, 10 machine guns. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, the name itself, Flying Fortress, suggested invulnerability. Suggested that bombers could fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. Suggested that massed defensive firepower would destroy any attacking fighters. That theory was being tested right now over Schweinfurt, and the theory was failing catastrophically. Flying Fortress 297 had been hit by a single 20mm cannon shell from a German Bf-109 fighter. The fighter cost approximately $50,000 to build, roughly 1/300th the cost of the bomber. The cannon shell cost about $5. One $5 shell from one $50,000 fighter was destroying one $400,000 bomber carrying 10 men and 6 tons of bombs. The pilot, Captain Robert Williams, 24 years old from Iowa, fought the controls. The bomber was losing altitude, 2 engines were dead, a third was on fire, the fourth was running but damaged. The aircraft was doomed. Williams knew it, his crew knew it. But they were over Germany, over enemy territory, hundreds of miles from safety. Williams gave the order to bail out. 9 crew members scrambled for parachutes. They jumped into German airspace. 5 would be captured immediately. 3 would die from injuries sustained during bailout. 1 would evade capture for 3 days before being caught by Wehrmacht patrol. Williams stayed with the aircraft, trying to keep it level so his crew could escape, trying to prevent it from going into spin that would make bailout impossible. The flames spread closer. The heat became unbearable. The controls stopped responding. He finally bailed out at 8,000 feet. His parachute deployed. He floated down watching his bomber, America's most advanced weapon system, spiral into the ground and explode. Williams landed in a field. German soldiers captured him within an hour. He spent the next 20 months in Stalag Luft III, prisoner of war camp. His bomber was one of 60 B-17s shot down during the Schweinfurt raid. 60 Flying Fortresses lost in a single mission, 600 crew members killed or captured, $14 million in aircraft destroyed in one afternoon. And this was not an anomaly. This was the reality of strategic bombing in 1943. The bombers that were supposed to win the war alone. The bombers that cost $14 billion. The bombers that were supposed to be invincible. They were being destroyed by cheap fighters. Destroyed by simple tactics. Destroyed by physics and engineering realities that bombers could not overcome. This is the true story of the B-17 Flying Fortress. The bomber that was supposed to change warfare. The weapons program that consumed billions. The strategic bombing theory that failed catastrophically. And the men who paid the price for doctrinal arrogance. A story about how expensive technology does not guarantee victory. How strategic theories can ignore inconvenient realities. How soldiers die when planners refuse to acknowledge that their assumptions are wrong. This is the story of why the $14 billion bomber could not hit its targets. And how $50,000 fighters destroyed them by the hundreds. The theory began in the 1920s, after the First World War, after 4 years of trench warfare that killed millions and accomplished nothing. After military planners realized that ground combat had become impossible stalemate. Italian General Giulio WWII published a book in 1921 called The Command of the Air. His argument was revolutionary. Future wars would be won by bombing. Not by armies, not by navies, by aircraft destroying enemy industrial capacity and civilian morale. WWII argued that bombers could fly over ground defenses, could strike deep into enemy territory, could destroy factories and power plants and transportation networks, could make it impossible for enemy to continue fighting. His theory suggested that wars could be won quickly, without massive ground campaigns, without millions of casualties. Just bomb the enemy into submission, destroy their ability to produce weapons, destroy their will to fight, win through air power alone. American military planners were fascinated by this theory. It offered hope of avoiding another trench warfare catastrophe. It suggested that technology could replace mass armies. It aligned with American industrial strengths and technological advantages. The Army Air Corps, precursor to the Air Force, embraced strategic bombing as doctrine, built their entire strategy around it, designed aircraft specifically for this mission, developed tactics for penetration bombing deep into enemy territory. But the theory had assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong, assumptions that would cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars before being acknowledged. First assumption: bombers could fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. The reasoning was that bombers flying in tight formation could mass defensive firepower. That 10 bombers with 100 machine guns could destroy any attacking fighters. That defensive firepower made escort unnecessary. Second assumption: bombers could hit precision targets from high altitude. That bombardiers using Norden bomb sites could drop bombs accurately from 25,000 feet. That factories and power plants could be destroyed surgically without massive area bombing. Third assumption: bombing would break enemy morale. That civilian populations subjected to strategic bombing would demand peace. That governments would surrender rather than endure continued bombing. All three assumptions were wrong, completely wrong, provably wrong. But strategic bombing doctrine was built on these assumptions, and billions of dollars were invested before anyone questioned whether the theory matched reality. Boeing designed the B-17 specifically for strategic bombing mission. The requirements were clear: long range to penetrate deep into enemy territory, high-altitude capability to avoid anti-aircraft fire, heavy defensive armament to fight off interceptors, large bomb load to damage industrial targets. The B-17 that emerged was impressive aircraft by 1930s standards, 4 engines providing 4,800 total horsepower, wingspan of 103 feet, maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds, range of 2,000 miles with full bomb load. Defensive armament was extraordinary: 10 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in nose, 2 in dorsal turret, 2 in ventral turret, 2 in waist positions, 2 in tail position, 100 machine guns in a formation of 10 bombers, overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. The theory was that attacking fighters would be destroyed before they could inflict serious damage. That massed machine gun fire would create impenetrable defensive barrier. That formations of bombers would be effectively invulnerable. Boeing test pilots were confident. Army Air Corps generals were confident. Everyone was confident that the B-17 would revolutionize warfare, but confidence was not based on realistic combat testing. Was based on exercises where friendly fighters made mock attacks under artificial conditions. Was based on assumptions about how combat would actually work. Was based on theory rather than reality. No one had tested the B-17 against determined attacks by modern fighters using realistic tactics. No one had tested whether bombers could actually hit precision targets from high altitude. No one had tested whether strategic bombing would actually break enemy morale. The theory was elegant, the engineering was impressive, the confidence was absolute. The reality would be catastrophic. The B-17 production program was enormous. Army Air Corps ordered 12,131 B-17s between 1939 and 1945. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed all manufactured them. Production peaked at 16 aircraft per day. Cost per aircraft was approximately $240,000 in 1940s dollars, equivalent to roughly $4 million in 2024 dollars. Total program cost exceeded $3 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to approximately $50 billion today, but that calculation only included manufacturing costs, did not include development costs, did not include training costs, did not include base construction, did not include maintenance and spare parts, did not include fuel and ammunition. Total program cost, including all factors, exceeded $14 billion in 2024 equivalent dollars, making the B-17 the most expensive weapons program in American history up to that point. For comparison, the Manhattan Project cost approximately $25 billion in 2024 equivalent dollars. The B-17 program cost more than half the atomic bomb program, and the B-17 was supposed to make atomic weapons unnecessary by winning the war through conventional strategic bombing. $14 billion invested in theory that had never been tested in realistic combat. $14 billion based on assumptions about bomber invulnerability and precision bombing and breaking enemy morale. $14 billion that would be proven catastrophically wrong. The first B-17 combat missions were flown in 1942 against targets in occupied France and Belgium. Short-range missions with fighter escort available, limited opposition from German fighters. Results were disappointing, but not catastrophic. Bomb accuracy was poor, much worse than predicted by Norden bombsight theory. But losses were acceptable, usually less than 5% of aircraft dispatched. Army Air Force planners interpreted these results optimistically, blamed poor accuracy on crew inexperience, assumed accuracy would improve with training, assumed that longer-range missions against Germany proper would be equally survivable. These assumptions were wrong. The easy missions against lightly defended targets in France were not representative of what bombing Germany would entail. German air defenses in Germany proper were vastly stronger. German fighter tactics were evolving rapidly to counter bomber formations, but American planners did not want to acknowledge these problems. Strategic bombing doctrine was too important. Too much had been invested. Too many careers depended on proving the doctrine correct. So missions escalated. Targets in Germany were selected. Longer-range missions without fighter escort were planned. Formations of hundreds of bombers were assembled to prove that massed firepower would overcome fighter opposition. The planners were about to learn the difference between theory and reality, and thousands of young men were about to die in that learning process. Schweinfurt was ball-bearing manufacturing center, critical to German war industry. Destroying Schweinfurt's factories would supposedly cripple German aircraft production and shorten the war. American planners assigned 230 B-17s to attack Schweinfurt. The bombers would fly 500 miles into Germany without fighter escort. P-47 fighters could not fly that far. P-51 escorts with longer range were not yet available. The bombers would have to rely on massed defensive firepower. This was exactly what strategic bombing doctrine predicted would work. Tight formations, overlapping fields of fire, overwhelming defensive firepower, making fighter attacks suicidal. The mission launched on August 17, 1943. 230 flying fortresses carrying 2,300 crew members. Each bomber armed with 10 machine guns. Each crew confident in their invincible fortress. German radar detected the formation before it crossed into German airspace. Luftwaffe fighter controllers vectored every available fighter to intercept. Over 300 German fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were directed toward the bomber stream. The German fighters had been developing tactics specifically to counter bomber formations. They had learned that frontal attacks were most effective, that attacking from 12 o'clock high gave bombers minimal time to respond, that focused attacks on individual bombers could overwhelm defensive fire. The attacks began 200 miles from Schweinfurt, wave after wave of German fighters making head-on passes. 20mm and 30mm cannons firing from 800 yards, closing to 200 yards before breaking away. Each attack lasting only seconds, but inflicting terrible damage. B-17 defensive gunners fired thousands of rounds, but hitting fast-moving fighter making head-on pass was nearly impossible. The closure rate was over 600 miles per hour. The fighter was in range for only 2 or 3 seconds. Gunners had almost no time to aim and fire. German pilots quickly learned that the bomber's defensive fire was not as deadly as predicted, that most shots missed, that even getting hit did not necessarily down a fighter, that persistent attacks would eventually destroy bombers despite return fire. The formation began falling apart. Individual bombers damaged and dropping out of formation, wounded crew members unable to man guns, dead pilots slumped over controls, Aircraft on fire, aircraft with engines destroyed, aircraft losing altitude and becoming easy targets for follow-up attacks. Captain Williams and Flying Fortress 297 were in the lead formation. They watched bombers ahead of them explode, watched bombers fall away trailing smoke, watched parachutes blossom as crews bailed out, watched the sky fill with debris and aircraft parts and bodies. Williams' aircraft was hit at 10:47 a.m. A German Bf-109 made head-on pass. Its 20mm cannon fired brief burst. One shell struck bomber's number 3 engine. The engine exploded. Shrapnel damaged number 4 engine. Fire erupted in fuel system. Williams fought the controls. His co-pilot worked the fire extinguisher. His engineer tried to shut down the damaged engines. His bombardier aimed bombs by eye and released them early. His gunners kept firing at German fighters that swarmed around the damaged bomber. But the fire spread. The bomber lost altitude. German fighters sensed a wounded victim and pressed attacks. More shells hit the bomber, more damage accumulated, more crew members were wounded. Williams gave the order to bail out. His crew scrambled for parachutes and hatches. They jumped into hostile airspace, hundreds of miles from friendly territory. Williams stayed at the controls until the last crew member jumped. Then he jumped at 8,000 feet as the bomber entered terminal dive. The bomber crashed 5 miles from Schweinfurt, exploded on impact, scattered wreckage across German farmland. Added to the debris field of 60 B-17s shot down that day. 60 bombers lost, 600 crew members killed or captured, $14 million in aircraft destroyed. All in pursuit of target that was not even critically damaged, because the surviving bombers could not hit with precision from high altitude under fighter attack. The Schweinfurt raid proved that strategic bombing theory was wrong, proved that bombers could not survive without escort, proved that mass defensive firepower did not make bombers invincible, proved that precision bombing under combat conditions was impossible. But Army Air Force leadership did not acknowledge these lessons. Instead, they blamed crew performance, blamed bad weather, blamed tactical mistakes, anything except admitting that the fundamental doctrine was wrong. The Schweinfurt disaster should have forced reassessment of strategic bombing doctrine, should have led to cancellation of unescorted deep penetration missions, should have led to waiting for long-range escort fighters before resuming operations. Instead, Army Air Force leadership doubled down, ordered more missions, larger formations, deeper penetrations, convinced that persistence would prove the doctrine correct, convinced that German fighter defenses would eventually be overwhelmed. The second Schweinfurt raid was launched on October 14, 1943, less than 2 months after the first disaster. 291 B-17s attacked the same target. This time German fighters were even more prepared. They had refined their tactics. They knew exactly how to destroy bomber formations. 60 B-17s were shot down. 60 more were damaged beyond repair. 117 bombers lost from single mission. 1,170 crew members killed or captured. $28 million in aircraft destroyed in one afternoon. The losses were unsustainable. The bomber offensive was effectively defeated. Deep penetration missions were suspended. The strategic bombing theory that cost $14 billion was proven wrong by simple physics and determined defenders. German fighters that cost $50,000 each were destroying $400,000 bombers by the dozens. $5 cannon shells were achieving better cost-effectiveness ratio than any weapon in history. The expensive technological solution was losing to cheap determined opposition. The strategic bombing theory failed for 3 fundamental reasons that should have been obvious from basic engineering analysis. First reason, physics of defensive gunnery. Hitting fast-moving fighter from unstable bomber platform was nearly impossible. Gunners had to lead target, had to account for aircraft movement, had to fire accurately in few seconds available. Hit probability was less than 1%, even under ideal conditions. German fighters learned to exploit this, made high-speed passes minimizing exposure time, attacked from angles where bomber guns had limited traverse, focused on single bombers to overwhelm defenses, used tactics that made defensive fire irrelevant. Second reason, vulnerability of bombers. The B-17 had armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, but was still vulnerable to cannon fire. German 20mm and 30mm cannons could destroy critical systems with single hits, could kill crew members, could start uncontrollable fires, could damage flight controls. Bombers needed to survive hits and keep flying, but engineering reality was that aircraft weighing 65,000 pounds, flying at 25,000 feet, could not absorb much damage. One hit in wrong place could down bomber regardless of defensive measures. Third reason, impossibility of precision bombing. The Norden bomb site was theoretical marvel, but practical failure. Could not account for wind at different altitudes, could not compensate for aircraft movement under attack, could not function when pilot was evading fighters. Bombardiers were supposed to drop bombs from 25,000 feet and hit targets 200 feet across. This required accuracy better than 0.5% error. No mechanical system in 1940s could achieve this under combat conditions. The precision bombing theory was mathematically impossible. These problems were not secrets. They were known to anyone who understood physics and engineering. But strategic bombing doctrine ignored these inconvenient realities, preferred elegant theory over messy reality, preferred doctrinal purity over practical effectiveness. And thousands of young men died because planners refused to acknowledge that their theory was wrong. German fighter pilots initially feared the B-17. Early encounters with bomber formations showed devastating defensive firepower. German fighters taking casualties from massed machine gun fire. The myth of flying fortress invincibility seemed real, but experienced German pilots quickly learned the truth. The defensive fire looked impressive, but was mostly ineffective. Most rounds missed. Even hits rarely downed fighters unless they struck critical components. The fortress was not as invincible as its name suggested. Luftwaffe fighter tactics evolved rapidly. German pilots developed procedures specifically for attacking heavy bombers. Head-on attacks became standard. Attacking from 12 o'clock high minimized exposure to defensive fire and gave bombers minimal reaction time. German pilots learned to focus attacks. Instead of firing at entire formation, focus on single bomber. Multiple fighters attacking one bomber could overwhelm its defenses. Damaged bomber falling out of formation became easy target for follow-up attacks. The Germans also developed specialized aircraft for bomber attack. The FW-190 was armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Later variants added 30mm cannons. These weapons could destroy bombers with short bursts. Single 30mm shell could blow off bomber's wing. German pilots learned that B-17s had specific vulnerabilities. Cockpit area was poorly armored. Pilots were exposed to head-on fire. Killing or wounding pilots made bomber uncontrollable. Also, fuel systems were vulnerable, despite self-sealing tanks. Enough hits would overwhelm sealing ability and start fires. Experienced German pilots became expert at bomber attacks. They knew exactly where to aim, how long to hold fire, when to break away. They turned bomber interception into science. Each combat refined their tactics. Each engagement taught new lessons. By late 1943, German fighter pilots were routinely shooting down multiple bombers per mission. Aces like Egon Meyer and Walter Nowotny developed reputations as bomber killers. Meyer alone shot down 102 bombers. Other pilots scored similar tallies. The $14 billion bombers were being destroyed by pilots flying $50,000 fighters using tactics that cost nothing to develop. The expensive technological solution was losing to cheap tactical innovation. The economic disparity was staggering. Each B-17 cost approximately $400,000 in 1943 dollars. Each Bf-109 fighter cost approximately $50,000. One fighter cost 1/8 the price of one bomber. But the disparity was actually much greater when accounting for crew costs. Training a B-17 crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners cost approximately $1 million. Training a fighter pilot cost approximately $100,000, 10-to-1 cost ratio in training alone. When a B-17 was shot down, America lost $400,000 in aircraft plus $1 million in trained crew. Total loss of $1.4 million. When Bf-109 was shot down, Germany lost $50,000 in aircraft plus $100,000 in trained pilot. total loss of $150,000, the exchange ratio was nearly 10-1 in Germany's favor. Germany could afford to lose 10 fighters for every bomber shot down and still come out ahead economically. The actual exchange ratio in 1943 was approximately 3 bombers lost for every fighter lost. Germany was winning the economic attrition battle decisively. American industrial capacity could produce more bombers than Germany could produce fighters. America built 12,731 B-17s compared to Germany's 33,000 Bf-109s. But the point was that expensive technology was not automatically superior to cheap technology. Cost did not equal effectiveness. The strategic bombing theory assumed that expensive bombers with advanced technology would dominate cheap fighters with inferior technology. This assumption was wrong. The cheap fighters were more cost-effective. The expensive bombers were hemorrhaging losses and accomplishing minimal strategic impact. The solution to bomber losses was not better bombers, was not more defensive armament, was not tighter formations or better tactics. The solution was admitting that bombers needed fighter escorts. The P-51 Mustang was that escort. Long-range fighter with range matching the bombers, could escort bomber formations all the way to targets deep in Germany, could engage German fighters and drive them away from bombers. The P-51 cost approximately $50,000, same as German fighters, but it was superior fighter, faster than Bf-109, more maneuverable than FW-190, armed with 650 caliber machine guns. Pilots loved flying it. Germans feared encountering it. When P-51s began escorting bombers in early 1944, bomber losses dropped immediately. German fighters could no longer attack bombers with impunity. Had to fight through P-51 escorts. Many German fighters were shot down before reaching bombers. The P-51 proved that the correct solution was cheap dedicated fighters, not expensive invulnerable bombers. Cost-effective escort fighters protecting bombers, not relying on bombers to defend themselves. But this meant admitting that strategic bombing doctrine was wrong. That $14 billion had been invested in flawed theory. That thousands of men had died unnecessarily. That Army Air Force leadership had been catastrophically wrong about fundamental assumptions. The leadership never admitted this, never acknowledged that the doctrine was wrong. Continued claiming that strategic bombing theory was correct and only implementation needed refinement. Continued insisting that B-17s were successful despite catastrophic losses in 1943. The actual lesson that cheap fighters were more effective than expensive bombers in combat was never officially acknowledged. The expensive failed program was defended. The cheap successful solution was treated as mere supporting role rather than proof that original doctrine was wrong. Captain Williams landed in German field after bailing out of his burning bomber. His parachute descent took about 5 minutes from 8,000 feet. He had those 5 minutes to watch his aircraft spiral into the ground and explode. Had those 5 minutes to realize he would spend rest of war as prisoner. Had those 5 minutes to wonder if his crew survived. German soldiers captured him within an hour. Wehrmacht patrol saw his parachute descent. They were waiting when he landed. They searched him for weapons and intelligence materials. They marched him to local military post. Williams was interrogated for 3 days. German intelligence wanted information about bomber tactics, navigation systems, defensive measures. Williams gave only name, rank, and serial number as required by Geneva Convention. The interrogators were professional. No torture, no threats. Just persistent questioning that Williams refused to answer. After interrogation, Williams was transported to Stalag Luft III, prisoner of war camp. This was where RAF and US AAF airmen were held. The camp eventually held over 10,000 Allied airmen. All shot down over Germany, all spending months or years as prisoners. Life in Stalag Luft III was monotonous. Food was minimal, about 1,500 calories per day. Not enough for active men, but enough to survive. Red Cross parcels supplemented rations when available. Prisoners organized themselves into groups for sharing food and maintaining morale. Entertainment consisted of makeshift theater productions, educational classes, sports competitions. Prisoners carved chess pieces from wood scraps, made playing cards from cardboard. did anything to occupy time and maintain sanity. Boredom was the enemy as much as hunger. Williams spent 20 months in Stalag Luft III, from August 1943 until April 1945, when advancing Allied armies liberated the camp. 20 months wondering if the war would end before he starved. 20 months learning about other crews shot down. 20 months realizing the bomber offensive was failing despite official claims of success. He learned that 60 B-17s were lost on Schweinfurt mission. Learned that another 60 were lost 2 months later on second Schweinfurt raid. Learned that hundreds of bombers were being shot down. Learned that strategic bombing was not winning the war as promised. Every new prisoner brought stories of missions gone wrong, of formations decimated by German fighters, of crews killed or captured, of bombers lost before reaching targets. The evidence was overwhelming that strategic bombing doctrine was failing. But Williams and other prisoners could do nothing except endure. They were statistics in failed strategy. They were proof that theory did not match reality. They were victims of doctrinal arrogance that refused to acknowledge failure. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 80,000 American airmen were killed or missing in European theater. Most were bomber crews. Most died on missions deep into Germany. Most died because strategic bombing doctrine insisted bombers could operate without fighter escort. The casualty rate among bomber crews was approximately 50%. 50% of men who flew bombers did not survive the war. Half were killed or captured. This was highest casualty rate of any American military unit in World War II. To put this in perspective, infantry casualty rate was approximately 20%. Even frontline infantry fighting in Europe had better survival odds than bomber crews. The most dangerous job in American military was flying bombers over Germany. Each bomber loss meant 10 men killed or captured. 60 bombers lost at Schweinfurt meant 600 casualties. 117 bombers lost in second Schweinfurt raid meant 1,170 casualties. The numbers were staggering. The human cost was immense. These were not just statistics. These were young men. Average age was 23. Most had never been to Europe before the war. Most came from small towns across America. Most volunteered for bomber service, thinking they were joining elite force with advanced technology. They believed the promises about flying fortress invulnerability, believed defensive firepower would protect them, believed precision bombing would win the war, believed they were part of revolutionary military strategy. They learned the truth when German fighters attacked, when their bombers exploded around them, when they watched friends die, when they bailed out over enemy territory or rode burning aircraft to the ground. The survivors carried psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not diagnosed or treated in 1940s. Veterans were expected to return to normal life and not discuss their experiences. Many did not discuss war experiences, even with families. Carried memories of friends dying and bombers burning and terror of combat in silence. Strategic bombing doctrine killed 80,000 American airmen. Doctrine that insisted bombers could operate without escort. Doctrine that refused to acknowledge obvious vulnerabilities. Doctrine that prioritized theoretical elegance over practical effectiveness. Army Air Force leadership knew the casualties were unsustainable. New bomber crews had 50% casualty rate. New entire crews were being lost on single missions. But leadership refused to change doctrine because admitting failure would have undermined entire strategic bombing theory. Careers depended on strategic bombing being successful. Promotions depended on proving doctrine correct. The future of independent Air Force depended on demonstrating that air power could win wars without armies. So missions continued despite losses. Formations of hundreds of bombers were sent into Germany without adequate escort. Crew members were told they were winning the war through strategic bombing, even as casualty rates reached 50%. Young men died by the thousands to preserve doctrinal purity. This was not unique to American military. All militaries throughout history have sacrificed soldiers to preserve failed doctrines. French army attacked German machine guns with bayonet charges in World War I because doctrine said elan would overcome firepower. Japanese military launched banzai charges against American positions in Pacific because doctrine said Japanese spirit would overcome American material superiority. In every case, doctrine was wrong. In every case, soldiers died. In every case, leadership refused to acknowledge failure until casualties became catastrophic. The difference with strategic bombing was scale of investment. $14 billion invested in doctrine that killed 80,000 men. Most expensive failed doctrine in military history. Most catastrophic misapplication of resources and lives. The men who designed the B-17 were brilliant engineers. The men who flew the B-17 were brave airmen. But the men who insisted that B-17s could operate without escort were wrong. And 80,000 young men paid the price for that wrongness. After the war, Army Air Force leadership wrote official histories of strategic bombing campaign. These histories emphasized successes, downplayed failures, claimed strategic bombing was decisive in defeating Germany. The histories acknowledged that losses were high in 1943, but blamed this on lack of fighter escorts, not on flawed doctrine. Claimed that once P-51 escorts became available, strategic bombing achieved all objectives. Claimed precision bombing destroyed German war industries. Post-war analysis told different story. German industrial production actually increased throughout 1943 and 1944, despite strategic bombing. Albert Speer, German armaments minister, dispersed factories and moved production underground. Bomb damage was repaired quickly. Strategic bombing did not cripple German war economy as predicted. German civilian morale did not break. Cities were devastated, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. But German resistance continued until Soviet armies reached Berlin. Strategic bombing did not force surrender through breaking morale as WWII theory predicted. The strategic bombing campaign ultimately succeeded in 1945, not by destroying factories or breaking morale, but by forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers manning air defenses. Thousands of fighter aircraft defending against bombers instead of supporting ground forces. This was useful contribution to victory, but not what strategic bombing doctrine predicted. Doctrine said bombing would win war by itself. Reality was that bombing forced resource diversion that helped armies win war. Very different outcome than promised. But official histories never acknowledged this discrepancy. Never admitted that strategic bombing doctrine was fundamentally flawed. Never acknowledged that $14 billion was invested in failed theory. Never acknowledged that 80,000 men died unnecessarily. Admitting strategic bombing failure would have had catastrophic consequences for Army Air Force leadership, would have undermined arguments for independent Air Force, would have suggested that air power was merely supporting role for armies rather than war-winning force by itself. Air Force independence was approved in 1947. The United States Air Force became separate service branch. This decision was based largely on claims that strategic bombing in World War II proved air power could win wars independently. If Air Force leadership had admitted that strategic bombing failed to achieve doctrinal objectives, the argument for independence would have collapsed. Air Force would have remained part of Army. Generals who championed strategic bombing would have seen careers destroyed. So the official narrative emphasized successes, ignored failures, claimed precision bombing destroyed German industries, claimed bomber formations with defensive firepower were effective, claimed strategic bombing was vindicated by victory. The actual lessons, that strategic bombing doctrine was wrong, that bombers needed escorts, that precision bombing was impossible, that industrial targeting was ineffective, were never officially acknowledged. The failure to learn from World War II led to repeated mistakes in subsequent wars. Korea, Vietnam, both featured strategic bombing campaigns based on same flawed assumptions as World War II campaigns. In Korea, B-29 bombers attacked North Korean industrial targets. Results were minimal. North Korea had limited industry. Destroying factories did not affect military capability. Strategic bombing accomplished little. In Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder bombed North Vietnamese targets for 3 years. Dropped more bombs than all World War II strategic bombing. Failed to break North Vietnamese will to fight. Failed to stop supplies flowing south. Failed to achieve any strategic objectives. The same mistakes were repeated. Assumption that bombing would break enemy morale. Assumption that destroying industry would prevent continued fighting. Assumption that air power alone could win wars. All proven wrong in World War II. All repeated anyway. Why? Because admitting mistakes would require acknowledging that strategic bombing doctrine was flawed. Would require admitting that billions of dollars were wasted. Would require admitting that independent Air Force strategy was based on failed theory. Institutional incentives prevented learning. Careers depended on claiming strategic bombing was successful. Budgets depended on continued investment in strategic bombers. Service independence depended on maintaining myth that air power could win wars alone, so the mistakes continued. Different wars, different targets, same flawed doctrine, same failed assumptions. Same refusal to acknowledge that theory did not match reality. The real lesson of the B-17 story is not about technology or tactics. It's about institutional inability to acknowledge failure. About how careers and budgets and service rivalries prevent learning from mistakes. About how men die when institutions refuse to admit they were wrong. The B-17 was not a bad aircraft. Was well designed for its intended mission. The problem was the mission itself was based on flawed assumptions. Bombers could not survive without escorts. Defensive firepower could not stop determined fighters. Precision bombing was impossible under combat conditions. These problems were obvious from basic engineering analysis, were proven repeatedly by combat experience, were acknowledged by frontline air crews who flew the missions, but were never officially admitted by leadership because admission would have undermined entire strategic bombing edifice. $14 billion invested, 80,000 men killed, all to preserve doctrine that was wrong from the beginning. All because admitting mistakes would have had unacceptable consequences for institutions and careers. This pattern is not unique to military, appears in every large organization. Corporations continue failed strategies because executives cannot admit mistakes. Governments continue failed policies because politicians cannot acknowledge errors. Institutions defend failed doctrines because change threatens careers and budgets and power structures. The B-17 story is a reminder that expensive technology does not guarantee success. That institutional momentum can persist despite overwhelming evidence of failure. That men pay price for leadership's refusal to acknowledge mistakes. The $14 billion bomber that could not hit its targets. The expensive fortress destroyed by cheap fighters. The failed doctrine that killed 80,000 men. The lessons that were never learned because learning them would have required admission of failure. This is the true story of strategic bombing in World War II, not the official history, not the myth of precision bombing and broken enemy morale. The actual story of failed doctrine and wasted resources and men who died because leadership refused to admit they were wrong. The P-51 Mustang worked, long-range fighter escort protecting bombers, cost-effective solution that reduced losses dramatically. Cheap aircraft performing essential mission that expensive bombers could not perform themselves. The tactical evolution worked. Bomber crews learning defensive tactics through bitter experience. Formation flying that actually worked rather than theoretical formations. Coordination between bombers and escorts. Practical solutions developed by air crews rather than imposed by doctrine. The industrial attrition worked. American production capacity eventually overwhelming German capacity. Building faster than Germany could destroy. This was not what doctrine predicted, but was what actually happened. Victory through industrial capacity rather than strategic bombing theory. What did not work was the strategic bombing doctrine itself. Bombers did not win war by destroying German industry. Precision bombing did not destroy critical targets. Enemy morale did not break. The fundamental theory was wrong. But partial successes, fighter escorts, tactical evolution, industrial attrition, allowed leadership to claim vindication, allowed continued investment in strategic bombing, allowed doctrine to survive despite failures. Robert Williams survived Stalag Luft III, was liberated when American armies reached the camp in April 1945, weighed 135 pounds when freed, had lost 40 pounds during 20 months' imprisonment. He returned to America in May 1945, received medical treatment for malnutrition, spent 3 months in hospital recovering, received honorable discharge from Army Air Force in August 1945, Williams returned to Iowa, tried to resume normal life, married his high school girlfriend, worked on family farm, raised 3 children, never discussed war experiences with family, carried memories in silence as most veterans did. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder, though it was not called that in 1940s. Had nightmares about burning bomber, about bailing out, about German prison camp. Woke up screaming. Never sought treatment because treatment did not exist. His wife learned not to ask about war. His children learned not to mention bombers or Germany. The family adapted around his trauma without discussing it. This was normal for World War II families. Veterans suffered, families endured. Nobody talked about it. Williams died in 1987 at age 68. Heart disease likely worsened by wartime stress and malnutrition. His obituary mentioned his military service, said he was decorated pilot who flew combat missions over Germany. Did not mention he was shot down, did not mention prison camp, did not mention trauma. Most veterans of strategic bombing campaign had similar experiences, survived the war but carried psychological damage for rest of their lives. Refused to discuss experiences because discussion would have required reliving trauma. Died without telling their stories. Final accounting of B-17 program, 12,131 aircraft, built $3 billion manufacturing costs, 1940s dollars, 14 billion total program cost, 2024 equivalent. 4,735 B-17s lost in combat, 80,000 American airmen killed or captured. Unknown number of German civilians killed. Return on investment. German industrial production increased despite bombing. German morale never broke. War won by ground armies, not strategic bombing. Strategic bombing theory proven wrong. Doctrine survived and continued despite failure. Cost per bomber destroyed, $3 million, 2024 equivalent. Cost per bomb dropped on target, $5,000, 2024 equivalent. Cost per German civilian killed, $175,000, 2024 equivalent. None of these metrics suggest strategic bombing was cost-effective military strategy. All suggest massive waste of resources and lives, but official histories emphasize successes and minimized failures. Doctrine survived. What if strategic bombing doctrine had been tested realistically before war? What if Army Air Force had acknowledged bomber vulnerabilities? What if they had waited for long-range escorts before launching deep penetration missions? Thousands of lives could have been saved. Billions of dollars could have been spent more effectively. The same ultimate victory could have been achieved with far fewer casualties. But these questions were never asked officially, were never investigated by military historians writing official accounts, were never acknowledged by Air Force leadership defending their doctrine and careers. The men who designed failed doctrine were promoted. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded strategic bombing campaign, became Air Force Chief of Staff. Other leaders of bomber offensive received similar promotions. None were held accountable for catastrophic losses in 1943. The men who flew the missions and died by thousands were forgotten, remembered as heroes who sacrificed for victory, not remembered as victims of failed doctrine and leadership arrogance. Their deaths were sanitized into necessary sacrifices rather than unnecessary casualties of flawed strategy. The B-17 Flying Fortress was magnificent aircraft poorly employed in pursuit of failed doctrine. The men who flew it were brave. The men who maintained it were skilled. The men who designed it were brilliant. But the men who insisted it could operate without escort were wrong. The men who claimed defensive firepower would stop determined fighters were wrong. The men who believed precision bombing would win the war were wrong. $14 billion invested in wrong theory. 80,000 men killed by wrong doctrine. Decades of subsequent mistakes repeated because admission of failure was institutionally impossible. The expensive bomber destroyed by cheap fighter. The invincible fortress shot down by hundreds. The precision bombing that could not hit targets. The strategic theory that never worked as predicted. This was reality of strategic bombing in World War II. Not the myth of flying fortress invulnerability. Not the legend of precision bombing destroying German industry. Not the claim that air power alone won the war. The actual story of failed doctrine that killed thousands. Of leadership that refused to acknowledge mistakes. of institutions that prioritized self-preservation over learning from failure. Remember the B-17. Remember the men who flew it. Remember the men who died in it. But also remember the lesson: expensive technology does not guarantee victory. Failed doctrine kills regardless of cost. Institutions refuse to learn when learning threatens their existence. The $14 billion bomber could not hit its targets. The $50,000 fighter shot it down. That is the truth that official histories never admitted. That is the lesson that was never learned. That is the price of institutional arrogance.